Hello everybody, coming in for the second video of this American Revolution series as I promised earlier with the last one that we did earlier this week. I hope to have the third one up possibly Sunday or Monday, and hopefully we'll wrap this up by the 4th of July itself, which is in fact the goal, to have us this all available for views on by the 4th of July holiday, which is next Saturday. So we got about a week. So on this second video, we're going to cover here, as we left off in the last one, we talked about the French and Indian War, which ended in 1763, and that really is a prelude to initiating things that are going to bring the colonists in the British North American colonies to revolution, and we kind of stopped there. So this second video, we are going to cover the protests and different acts that occurred between 1763 at the end of the French and Indian War and up to April of 1775 with the initial breakout of the American Revolution with the battles of Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts. So let's just go ahead and we're going to go ahead and get into this and go through. I'll make any announcement at the end. So, as we mentioned, at the end of the French and Indian War, Britain won. France was basically wiped all of its colonial territories off the face of the North American continent. It had to divide them between Britain, who had won the war, and its former ally, Spain. Well, this was all good and goody for Britain. However, there was a major problem. As we mentioned in the previous video, the British Prime Minister who turned the war effort around, a man by the name of William Pitt. Again, this is him if you do not remember him. He's actually going to come short play here, again briefly. But anyway, William Pitt became British Prime Minister in about, I wouldn't say Prime Minister, but big war planner, I guess, for the British is what you would say, director of the war effort, in about 1758. And after this, Britain's luck turned around tremendously in the French and Indian War. But this was mostly due to one thing, and Pitt had decided to pour, and I mean pour, funds and money into the war effort, to pour them to get new soldiers, recruit new soldiers, to make new weapons, and everything else. And he even borrowed heavily from banks in other countries in order to fund this effort. So Britain's won. That's a good thing for them. They've got the land they wanted. The colonists can expand. They've got exactly what they want. But now all that money that they just borrowed and spent is coming back to bite them in the rear end, because as with any economy, if you spend a bunch of money and you're borrowing a bunch of money, what's that going to place you in? A bunch of debt. Britain's debt, by the end of the French and Indian War, has actually about doubled. It went from being 72 million pounds in 1756 to, in 1763, at the end of the French and Indian War, Britain's debt had gone to 130 million pounds. In comparison, for dollar amounts today here in the United States, you're talking, in 1756, Britain had a debt of $15.3 billion, and now it has risen to $27.2 billion. It's about doubled. And that's never a good thing. It's a very hampering thing to the economy. So Britain's first real big priority after the war's done is to, okay, we need to lessen the debt. Let's pay off our debt. How do we do this? And Britain starts considering its options, mostly Parliament, who was the main government lawmaking body in Britain. Because remember, the king, after the English Civil War, kind of had more limited powers. So what happens is the 13 colonies become the main target of this new policy. The British Parliament ultimately comes up with the way to solve our debt problem is to impose new taxes. Yes, that wonderful T word that we love even today, when the wonderful IRS comes and tells you, oh, you owe this. Yes, we all just love the IRS, don't we? Yes, we do. Ugh. Anyway, Britain has the same idea. Pass new taxes in order to pay off our debt, which, in economic terms, is not a bad idea. Well, here's where things start going south. Instead of taxing everyone in the Britain's empire, not just the North American colonies, they choose to put the bulk of the taxes on the North American colonies. Why, you may ask? because the British deemed that since most of the land gained in the French and Indian War was located in North America and had really been gained and gave the colonists an advantage, they deemed that the colonists had really, and the colonists also, they'd wiped out the French threat. The French were no longer a threat to the colonists. So the Parliament deemed that since the colonists had seemingly benefited the most from the war, they should be the ones to have to pay the bill. Well, this is where a problem's going to start forming, is because, one thing, people never like taxes. I don't care where you're from, you don't like taxes. You don't. I don't like taxes. No human being likes being taxed. I can just tell you that now. The second part comes with Britain until now had largely let the 13 British colonies, it had largely let its colonies in America kind of govern themselves, so to speak. Their colonial legislatures were in charge of their own economies. They were in charge of their own systems. Britain largely had a hands-off approach to it for a while, let them kind of fend for themselves. Virginia's legislature was responsible for its economy. New York's legislature was responsible for its economy. Massachusetts was responsible for its, Pennsylvania, and so on and so on. Britain hadn't really put a direct control on either of those economies, and until now, they've had no need. Well, now they want to pass these new taxes, so Britain starts kind of exerting a little bit of control over the colonies, and they're not used to this. They're like, whoa, what is happening here? What are you doing? We're taking control. You're our colony, ding-dong. What do you think we're doing? Well, I'm not used to this. Get used to it. Anyway, this is where things start going awry. Now, Britain, in its first act of taxation that it passes after the end of the French and Indian War, becomes known as the Sugar Act, which is passed in April of 1763, the year that the war has ended, in that February. So this is 2 months after the war ends. Parliament passes its first Taxation Act. The Sugar Act, basically, it lowers the tax on foreign molasses. Now, at first you're like thinking, well, if it lowers the tax, why is it a bad thing? Well, it lowers the tax on sugar or molasses, that stuff that you put in gingerbread, but it also, at the same time, required that certain items being shipped from the colonies could only be shipped to Britain. Before this, as we mentioned, Britain had little hands-on. The traders and merchants in the colonies were largely free to send their products anywhere in the world, wherever they wanted. They didn't just have to send them to Britain. They could send them to France, Prussia, Spain, Portugal, even Russia. They could send them anywhere. Well, now Britain's telling them that certain products, even though other countries may pay a higher price for them, you must send to us. We will not let you send them there. This starts ticking the merchants off, because now they're not making as much money as they used to. And Britain knows that since they're required to, British merchants are going to know back home that since the colonies are required to ship those certain items only to them, they can charge a lower price because they know the colonists have no choice but to sell them in Britain. These were all, the Sugar Act was mainly the main brainchild, and the upcoming act that we're also going to discuss were the main brainchild of Prime Minister George Grenville, who had kind of took an office in 1763, and he didn't last very long either due to the unpopularity of the Taxation Acts that got passed under his little tenure as Prime Minister. And in 1765, you get an even worse act that really ticks the colonists off, and this is what we know as the Stamp Act, and this is much more famous. The Stamp Act required that every legal periodical, any legal paper and document had to be printed on officially stamped paper that was made in Britain, and that the paper had to be paid for in British only currency. They could not use colonial currency to pay for the paper. But since basically any important governmental document, like a deed to a property, a marriage certificate or whatever it's called, an annulment, a newspaper, anything like that had to be printed on this paper and had that extra tax on it due to where it was made. And this kind of really starts the first major protest against an act of Parliament by the colonists in the Americas. The American colonists were very irate over this. They didn't like the idea that now they really couldn't escape paying a tax. And they start arguing that Parliament has no right to enforce the Stamp Act, because they start having the very big argument that Parliament has no right because the American colonies cannot be taxed on the concept of no taxation without representation, which meant basically the colonies, although they were subject to the British Crown, they had no representatives in the British Parliament. Parliament may have made their laws, but they had no representatives in Parliament to even represent the colonies. So a lot of people in the colonies started asking the question, well, what right does Parliament have to tax us if we have no say in our own matters? If we have no say in the governmental body, but yet they get to govern us, how is that right? Which is not right. Some colonies openly kind of went and open statements that they did not approve of the Stamp Act, including Virginia and Rhode Island. Both of them passed resolves stating that only the colonial governments had the right to tax the colonists. Parliament could not tax you, only the colonial legislatures could. And in October of 1755, this kind of comes to a head in another act of kind of unification, of cooperation between the colonies, which is just budding at this time. And this happens in October of 1755. Oh, I apologize, 1765. And 27 delegates meet from 9 of the 13 colonies in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Oh, actually, I get this wrong. In New York. I think Albany, New York, maybe? I'm not entirely sure what city. I don't think it was New York City, though. But it was in New York, and they draft what they called the Declaration of Rights and Grievances. And this little declaration, it argues only the colonial legislatures could tax the colonists. Parliament basically it's a fancy way of saying 9 of the 13 colonies unanimously say Parliament has no right to be taxing us. Subsequently, they also sent this declaration to both Parliament and to King George III, who was the King of Britain at that time. And here's another picture of good old King George. And the colonists then start turning violent, and they start attacking and intimidating the tax collectors and customs officials that are enforcing the Stamp and Sugar Acts. And of course, there's also vocal critics who kind of feed this, and two of the most prominent became of the critics of these two acts were Samuel Adams of Massachusetts, who lived in Boston, and we're going to get back to him again later, and Patrick Henry of Virginia, who was most famous for, in 1775, he gave a speech to the Virginia House of Burgesses, which was the colonial legislature for Virginia, and which he kind of stated that either give me liberty or give me death. He's very famous for that speech. So they've sent an official declaration to Congress, the Parliament, and they sent it to the King. And now they're starting to turn violent. They're starting to turn against the people who are enforcing this law. The two acts are becoming extremely hard for Parliament to even enforce, because the American colonists are so opposed to them that they're even stopping the enforcement of them. And also, as I just mentioned, Samuel Adams, at the same time, this is when Samuel Adams starts creating his Sons of Liberty and the committees of correspondence that he kind of creates to help kind of connect protesters across the colonies, to build a unity network across the colonies to oppose these acts by Britain. Now, Parliament eventually kind of gets this declaration, so does the King. They come to the realization that there's no way we can enforce these acts, it just ain't going to work, and they actually repeal the Sugar Act in the Stamp Act in 1766. However, after they repeal these two acts, and the colonists are jubilant, they're excited, they finally got rid of this deadly tax, they've beaten Parliament. Parliament immediately kind of shouts back at them by declaring the Declaratory Act. And what the Declaratory Act does is it basically is simply a statement. It's not really a law. But it states that Parliament held and this is in the Act's own words here, I have it in quotations in our notebook. The Act said that Parliament held, and in quotation, I'm quoting now, full power and authority to make laws and statutes of sufficient force and validity to bind the colonies and the people of America in all cases whatsoever. Basically, a very fancy way of saying that Parliament does have the absolute right and power to tax you. And we will do so if we feel we need to. Basically, an outright, although they would repeal the acts, Parliament was basically saying, we don't recognize your declaration. We're saying that we do have the power to tax you when we want to. You don't. So Grenville also leaves in 1766 as prime minister due to his unpopularity both in the colonies and at home. And in his place, William Pitt, the guy that kind of led to the British winning the French and Indian War, he kind of takes power in 1766 in Parliament, and he becomes the new prime minister. So William Pitt, he starts pushing, immediately as getting office, he starts pushing for another set of taxes to be levied on the colonies. And he gives orders to the British Chancellor of Exchequer, Charles Townsend, to kind of formulate what these new taxes might be. And Townsend helps craft 4 new laws that eventually are passed by Parliament in June of 1767 that become known as the Townsend Acts. The Townsend Acts were a set of 4, and this is what they did. The first of these laws shuts down New York's assembly for refusing to enforce the royal governor's instructions to house British troops. Britain had passed the Quartering Act in 1765, which required American colonists at a military order to have to house soldiers within their homes. They had no choice in the matter because Britain was trying to fortify the new lands that they had gained in the Americas, and they were trying to increase their military presence there to try to beef up security in case the Spanish were to try something, and they saw that since the colonists had gained the most, again, they should be the ones to pay, so if we need housing for the soldiers, the colonists can be expected to have to house them. Which is kind of where our Third Amendment kind of comes from, the one that says you shall not have to quarter any soldiers without your consent, basically. The Third Amendment is, although it's kind of silly to think that would ever happen today, that's why they put that in there, is because this had happened with the British before the American Revolution. I might also want to add, at the same time as this was going on, the Townsend Acts, you also had chaos on the frontier that had also led to this militarization of it. And this also started with colonial protests in 1763, because although the colonists had just won all this new land, Indian fighting, just Native Americans started launching raids, they started launching wars against British troops because they started realizing the British colonists wanted to expand their land to the west, and they stood a direct opposition to them. And they started raiding, they started attacking, and to try to quell these attacks, King George III himself decreed a royal proclamation in 1763 that is known as the Proclamation of 1763, in which he dictated that settlement of the new lands acquired by Britain was forbidden west of the Appalachian Mountains. No colonists could settle there, and if any were caught, they would be forced to leave their homes and sent back to the colonies. Just to kind of get you a map here of what that was. Again, this is a map. The pink and red is what Britain owns now after the French and Indian War. Spain is in the yellow, but we're not going to really focus on Spain. The Mississippi River was mainly their boundary. Well, where the red stops and the pink begins, that's the proclamation line of 1763. Any settlement of the land beyond that line over here in the pink is forbidden. That's Indian land. And it starts ticking the colonists off because one of the reasons they supported the war was they thought they were going to be able to settle in this new acquired land, and now Parliament and the King is telling them, no, you're not. And many of them disobey it regardless. So tensions on the frontier build up, and that's partly why Britain was kind of increasing its military presence, was because of these raids by the Native Americans and these people that were disobeying the proclamation. And then, of course, you had the possibility that Spain may get a little bit feisty and decide to attack. Back to the Townsend Acts, anyway. We stated that it did shut down New York's assembly because it refused to enforce that act. At the same time, it's more controversial and one that actually outraged the colonists, where it placed a tax on materials such as lead, glass, paints, paper, and tea. Why tea? Because that is the big drink that everyone English and British drink. Speaking of drink, I'm going to take a drink of water. Excuse me. It's getting a little dry when I go through here. Alright, where are we at? Again, because of these new taxes, the colonists again are infuriated. They just beat the Stamp and Sugar Acts. Why are we being taxed on these? And of all the items that the Townsend Acts taxed, it was the one on tea that ticked them off the most. Because that's like, tea was the go-to drink in the colonies. It was, if you couldn't have water, if you wanted something other than water, you had tea. So the British, they knew this and took advantage of it. Well, the new set of laws draws immense frustration and immense protest throughout the colonies against them. And this time, the colonists take a different route. Instead of kind of just sending another declaration in which they know Parliament and the King would probably ignore, they decide to boycott. How we kind of discussed in the Civil Rights series, where after Rosa Parks was arrested, many African Americans in Montgomery, Alabama, refused to use the Montgomery bus system and boycotted it, and this eventually brought it to heat. Well, this is what the colonists do, except they boycott buying British goods. They will not buy them. Any goods coming from Britain will not be bought by the colonists. Instead, they start trying to remake them themselves. They try to make their own clothing, their own paper, their own items. That way, they don't have to buy them for Britain. Some of them even choose to give up tea just to avoid having to pay the tax to have to buy it. And this starts hurting British merchants, because a tax that's supposed to benefit them and help Britain pay off its debt and make more money is now becoming hard because the colonists are refusing to buy the items in the first place. Well, due to this increased resistance, Charles Townsend, who's still the commissioner, he creates a board of customs commissioners in the colonies, and this would act to convict anyone who violated the acts, anyone who tried to violate the taxes. Well, this doesn't help his image either, and it doesn't help the unrest in the colonies. And in fact, it sets one particular city on the path to really fiery protests, and that is none other than the city of Boston, Massachusetts, which becomes the big major hotbed up until the start of the Revolution. Boston, in 1768, gets occupied by British military troops under the command of General Thomas Gage, who sends them there from New York to try to quell the rising protests that are arising in Boston due to the Townsend Acts. And Gage brings about 4,000 troops with him there to try to enforce order in the city. However, some soldiers kind of side with the citizens in their anger, and Gage actually loses about 70 of these 4,000. About 70 of them actually desert. And eventually he starts learning what's going on, and he actually has one of them whose name was Private Richard Ames, and he is sentenced to be executed in Boston in October of 1768, which is then done. Kind of act as a message, don't desert or I'll kill you. But tensions don't go well. The Bostonians really don't like the president. They already are mad at the British Parliament for passing the taxes. Now they see the presence of the British soldiers as kind of oppressors who are enforcing Parliament's tyrannical views as they see it. So the presence of the British soldiers does kind of the opposite effect. It doesn't bring order, it kind of intensifies and brings more disorder. Well, in 1770, tensions really start boiling when many newspapers start reporting somewhat false accounts of some instances of crimes, supposedly that British soldiers have recently done to local colonists in Boston. Let me go through this. Let me make sure I got no photos here I gotta show anyone. I just want to make sure I'm not skipping nothing. And take a pause. Nope, no. Wait. Almost. Yeah, almost. Anyway, this starts once these are published in Boston and many of the newspapers, many of these people, they are already angry, so they really don't even think to maybe think about it a little bit and see if it is a lie, they just automatically believe it, and they start kind of getting even more and more and more and more angry. And then they get more and more and more angry again when in February of 1770 in Boston, a young boy whose name was Christopher Seider, he's killed by a customs official. And this enrages the people across the city. Many people actually go to his funeral, even ones that didn't know him. At the same time, the attacks on British customs officials are getting even worse because some of them are starting to tar and feather them and then pour tea down their throat. Oh yes, it was not pretty. Literally, they would dip them in tar, hot tar, then they throw a bucket of feathers all over them and make them look like living gigantic birds. Why, I don't know. And things finally come to a boiling point overboard on the night of March 5th of 1770 in Boston. On that night, a mob of angry citizens they start marching, and it's a very chilly night. It's early March, there's still snow up in New England, it's still snowy, it's icy, it's a cold night. And there's a mob of angry citizens that begins forming around a squadron of British soldiers in front of the Boston State House under the command of Captain Thomas Preston. Now, these squadrons of soldiers, they were just kind of guarding the State House, and these mobs started kind of forming around them, started just shouting insults at them, but eventually it starts getting a little more violent as the mob kind of starts picking up rocks, they pick up ice, they pick up snowballs, and they start throwing them and pelting the soldiers with these items. And eventually, one of the soldiers supposedly slips on ice. We honestly don't know what happened, but this is one of the common tales. And we don't know what caused the shot, I should say. And he accidentally, supposedly, fires a shot, and this sends the other soldiers who don't know where the shot just came from, they start opening fire into the crowd. 5 citizens end up being killed, including an African-American man by the name of Crispus Attucks, and 6 are ended up wounded. Boston, after this shooting that has just occurred, these British soldiers just opened fire into a crowd of, as many kind of Sons of Liberty would put it in correspondence, and kind of falsely they put it as a squadron of British soldiers just fired into a crowd of unarmed civilians. They weren't really, they were throwing objects. They kind of were just as guilty as the soldiers. In a way, not completely as guilty, but they had some guilt. But anyway, this sends Boston onto the verge of anarchy. The people are now outraged because now the British have killed colonists. They've spilled blood. And now they're especially enraged. It's not just taxes. Now the people have died. And they are ticked. And what happens is Governor Thomas Hutchinson of Massachusetts, he's a loyalist, he's a royal governor, he's very loyal to the king and Parliament. He recalls Preston and his squadron of soldiers to go to Castle Island in the Charles River, and they then go and have these soldiers tried at a trial. And oddly enough, the main defense attorney for these soldiers was John Adams, who was not only Samuel Adams's cousin, but is one of our future signers of the Declaration of Independence, and he's also our second president and our first vice president. And he actually defends the British soldiers. There's 5 of them that were indicted, and 3 were acquitted, and the last 2 suffered minor sentences. And when I say minor, I mean the only thing they got, even though they were convicted for manslaughter, only 2 of them were convicted for manslaughter. The only thing they got was a brand on the hand, a hot iron plate pressed into your hand. I mean, sure, it hurt, but it wasn't a hanging. It wasn't a killing. So people still don't think it's right. They still don't think justice has been done. Now, Patriot leaders in Boston, such as Samuel Adams, who we'll show you a photo of here. This is a small painting of Samuel Adams. He was the cousin to John Adams, but he was not exactly the same guy. No, this is not Sam Adams' beer. No, I want to make that clear. It might be named after him, but I'm not so sure he's the one. I don't think he founded it, no. Anyway, Sam Adams is one in Boston, and there's another one, a silversmith by the name, and I'm sure you've all heard this name from when you were in school, Paul Revere. And him and Adams become the most highly publicized critics against the incident. And they start calling it what they know it as the, and they're the ones that really term it as what we know of today as the Boston Massacre that happened on March 5th of 1770. In Parliament, in response to this, in response to the massacre, in response to the anarchic state of Boston, they decide that they are going to repeal most of the Townsend Acts. They're going to repeal the one on lead. They're going to repeal the one that suspends New York's assembly, the one on paint, the one on all the other things. But there's one that they do leave in place, and that is the one on tea. Uh-oh. Not good thing. And before we go on here and leave the Boston Massacre right here, this is a image of a printing image that Paul Revere printed himself at his print shop to illustrate the Boston Massacre. It's kind of inaccurate because it kind of portrays the colonists as innocent. It doesn't show them throwing anything. Revere, when he did this to try to draw sentiment, he made it appear as if the British were just opening fire out in the middle of the daylight when this was at nighttime. He made it appear as if they were firing just into an unarmed crowd that had done nothing. They were just standing there, and all of a sudden, oh yeah, open fire. That's not what happened. But this was to draw sentiment for the Patriot cause, so he was going to exaggerate a little bit. In real life, these people would have been throwing rocks and snowballs at them, and the soldiers did not join up in a firing line to do it. They kind of just opened fire on their own time. They were not given a command to open fire by an officer. So what happens is, in 1773, Parliament further protects this tax on the tea by passing the Tea Act that enforces the tax, and Boston once again becomes a hotbed of activity, even though it's rested for 2 years since the Boston Massacre. In 1773, it's uprising again, and they take it even to extremes this time. All the tea shipments that are coming into Boston arrive in Boston Harbor, and they are on tea ships. There's crates of them on these big cargo ships that come in, and the ships are often docked for days in the harbor, and the tea is not unloaded because of all the customary paperwork they got to go through to have the ship docked and unload the cargo and stuff like that. So usually, once the cargo ship was docked, the tea remained on the ship for a couple of days in the harbor. Well, people knew this. Sam Adams knew this. The Sons of Liberty and the Committees of Correspondence knew this. And they started formulating a plan. And what happens is a ship by the name of HMS Dartmouth arrives in December in Boston Harbor. And the colonists convene at the Old South Meeting House, and they resolve that they are not going to pay that tax on that ship's tea. They are not paying it. Well, because the ship cannot return to England right now, and there's no one going to buy the tea, so the tea has to be kept on the ship. It's kind of just stuck there. It's a sitting duck. And Samuel Adams gives orders to several men of the Sons of Liberty. And on the night of December 16th of 1773, they board the Dartmouth, and they take the cargo. They take all the tea crates. They're dressed as Mohawk Indians to try to convince the British that colonists aren't doing this, Indians are doing it. Well, they dress as Mohawk Indians, board the Dartmouth, and they take the chests of tea, crack them open, and pour the tea into the harbor. They're pouring all the tea into Boston Harbor, and what we commonly know today as the Boston Tea Party. Now, just how much tea got dumped? Well, let's try about 90,000 pounds. Someone's not going to get paid. And someone just lost a buttload of money. This is an engraving right here of the Boston Tea Party, of the colonists. Some of them, as you can kind of see, are dressed up as Native Americans. There was somewhat of a crowd just watching it. In real life, they weren't really cheering, but they were just kind of staying silent and watching. But many engravings will show them cheering that it was a big event, and they're just taking the tea things off this ship and just pouring them and dumping them. Well, this ends up in irating Parliament and Britain, who find out in January of 1774, since this happened in December of 1773. And they've had enough of Boston's hotbed activity, and instead of catering to them, this time they're going to punish them. And it's really what starts things off. The Boston Tea Party infuriates them, and in response, they pass 5 new acts in March of 1774 that, to Parliament, calls them the Coercive Acts. In the colonies, and here in America, we know them as the Intolerable Acts. And what these do are the following. There are 5 different measures that it does. Actually around 6, really. It said 5 laws, but they really have 6 measures. And the first measure, Boston Harbor is closed, effective on June 1st, which is critical to Boston's economy. If they can't operate the harbor, Boston gets a lot of its shipment food, it gets a lot of its supplies from the harbor. It's going to strangle Boston's economy. Royal Governor Thomas Hutchinson of Massachusetts has all the power to approve any appointment to a court or to appoint a customs official. So basically, the entire colony of Massachusetts is being placed under direct crown rule. Town meetings must have the governor's permission to convene. No town hall meetings can convene if the governor does not give the consent. Accused criminals can be extradited back to England for trial. Basically, even if you commit something here, they're going to take you back to England because they fear that if you have a trial here, you're going to have sympathetic rebels on your as your judges, as your jurors, and they want to take you back to England where no one knows you. British troops could be housed in private dwellings in your own home. And the final measure was something called the Quebec Act, which, although it didn't really directly impact the colonies, it expanded the land of the Canadian province of Quebec, which Britain had just gained from France at the end of the French and Indian War. All that land that the colonists had kind of been barred from getting, that basically what Britain did was give a huge chunk of that land, mainly around the Great Lakes. It gives it to Quebec, and I think it's actually outlined on the map. Yes, we actually have it right here. Anything north of the Ohio River anything north of this Ohio River was going to the province of Quebec. It just made the colonists angry because not only have they been barred from going out there and settling it, but now Britain's going to give some of it to another province, another colony. Why? It ticks them off. Well, Massachusetts is basically on its knees at this point because it cannot really do nothing. It's been shackled to the ground, so to speak, and the other colonies actually start standing up for Massachusetts and start kind of coming together. In September of 1774, delegates from every one of the colonies, with the exception of Georgia, and Georgia only didn't send one because at the time it was having Native American raids and it kind of needed British help, so they didn't want to be seen as rebelling against Britain because they may not get the help that they needed. So, had it not been for that, Georgia would have sent one too. But the other ones had no such qualms. They had no problem that they depended on Britain at the time, so they all sent delegates, with the exception of Georgia, to Philadelphia in September 1774 in what we know as the First Continental Congress. Now, the Congress agrees to a couple things. They agree that the consumption of British tea would completely cease. We're not buying British tea anymore. Imports from Britain were to be prohibited on December 1st of that year in 1774. We're no longer going to take anything that is being shipped from Britain. And they also agree that they will meet again in May of 1775 to determine whether to stop exports to Britain as well, whether or not they're going to ship things back to Britain. And they also sign a petition. The delegates also sign and send a petition to Parliament and King George to have the acts repealed, the Intolerable Acts repealed back to kind of help Massachusetts out. In Boston, General Thomas Gage suspends the court and the legislature, the colonial court and legislature in October, and he seizes gunpowder stocks in nearby Charlestown. Well, in response, some of the rebels up in Massachusetts have what they call the First Provincial Congress, and they start debating the factor if Britain continues to take their powder stores and weapons supply stashes, are the British just going to shoot them all once they get all the weapons that they need? No, the colonists can't rebel, so they can't fight back. So they start debating whether or not do we need to have our local militias just go to war with the British troops. Is that what it's really come to? Is it's gotten this bad that we got to go to that point? They're hoping it doesn't. Unfortunately, a couple months later, things finally come to a head. April 1775. General Thomas Gage is in Boston, and he gets word that rebel troops, that there are rebel colonial militias, are amassing weapon stockpiles in gunpowder stores in the neighboring towns of Boston to the north of Lexington and Concord. He also gets word that two of the rebel leaders, Samuel Adams and John Hancock, are up there meeting. Well, Gage receives orders from his higher ups to not only take the rebel stockpiles, but they also want him to arrest both Adams and Hancock. So Gage decides that he is going to march his troops to seize these stockpiles in Lexington and Concord, and they're going to arrest them. Well, Patriot spies kind of catch word of Gage's little plan that he has enveloped here. And on the night of April 18th of 1775, rebel riders set out from Boston after getting signal lights told to them telling them that the British are coming from both sea and by land, slightly. And they decide to go, and they had three big riders that go out that night. Of course, the most famous, and I'm sure we all know, is Paul Revere. Paul Revere goes out with two other men as well. There was William Dawes and Samuel Prescott, and they ride through the woods to warn the Minutemen, or militia, that are stationed at Lexington and Concord that the British are coming, that they're coming to seize the stockpiles, and that they also to warn Hancock and Adams, who is in Lexington, that you need to get out of here. They're coming. They're going to arrest you and probably kill you. So this gives Adams and Hancock time to get out of there. They do escape. They get out of there before the British ever get there, and it also gives the Minutemen time during the night to prepare for possible confrontation in the morning. Minutemen were so named Minutemen because they were trained to be ready in a minute's notice. Would literally knock on their door, they'll grab their gun, grab their hat, they're out and they're ready. It was not reality, but it was like a nickname that they were given. But they were basically just militia, local colonial militia. Well, they get to Lexington, they all warn them, well, they set off toward Concord, well, some of the British have gone ahead, scouts, and they actually capture both Revere and Dawes. Neither of them are killed, they eventually do get released, but Prescott is the only one that actually makes it to Concord, and he's the one that lets Concord know that they're coming, which is further away. Lexington is the first town, and then Concord is further north, so yeah, Lexington was going to find out before Concord was. So the next morning at Lexington, on the Lexington Green, the town square, kinda, right in the center of town, there are 80 Minutemen gathered. 80 Minutemen militia under the command of Captain John Parker, who was himself a veteran of the French and Indian War, and they stood prepared to fight the British, but they did not want to actually start a fight. They intended to back away peacefully if they could, and Parker even gave them the initial order. He was actually sick that day. He had a cold of some sort, and he even kind of told the men on Lexington Green, he told them, stand your ground, don't fire unless fired upon, but if they mean to have a war, let it begin here. Basically saying, we are not going to fire unless we're fired upon, but if the British want a war, by all means, let's go. Well, the British arrived that morning under the command of Major John Pitcairn, and Pitcairn, he commands that the rebels, as he calls them, to disperse. He wants them out. So some of the militia, the Minutemen, they start backing up peacefully. Well, for some reason, and we to this day don't know. We don't know whether it was a British regular, we don't know if it was a Minuteman, but someone on one of the two sides opened a fire with a gun. It didn't hit nobody, but it was a blank shot. But the fact that a gun had been fired startled the British troops, and in response, they lowered their arms and opened fire with a infantry volley, killing many of the Minutemen. The shot that started that whole incident, that kind of triggered this whole thing, is what we call the shot heard round the world. We don't know to this day who fired the first shot of the American Revolution. We really don't know. No one really knows for sure. Now, Parker's men, immediately after the British opened fire, they returned fire, as he stated. We will not fire unless we're fired upon. So, since no one really knew who started the shot, the first one that's actually documented to be sure for firing is the British. And Parker's men returned fire, which causes some of the British, the Pitcairn and his officers are still trying to restrain the infantry. They still don't want to open a big battle with them. They don't want to have to confront the militia. They don't want bloodshed. But many of the British soldiers who just thought they got fired at, just shot. Now, they did just get fired at by the Minutemen Militia. They fix their bayonets on the rifles and do an infantry bayonet charge that eventually kind of breaks apart Parker's militia. They scatter. So they've broken through Lexington, and the British are now marching to Concord. As they get toward Concord, they find that the stockpiles of the gunpowder and the weapons ammunitions have already been moved to sites out of the town. They don't know where they are, and they've already been moved. And at the same time, as they come toward the Old North Bridge in Concord, they encounter another group of Minutemen Militia, and they actually get kind of beat back by this one, and they decide to retreat and fall back. So to also put you here, if I remember right, there were 80 men at Lexington for the Americans or Minutemen, and the British had 700. It wasn't over 1,000; it was 700, but it's still many more than what they had. And at Concord, the British kind of turn around. They decide that, well, we don't know where the stockpiles are. Hancock and Adams are gone. Our objectives were failed. Let's retreat back to Boston. Get back. Fall back. Well, the British kind of get dogged the entire way back to Boston, as all the long way back through the little country roads, many of the Minutemen Militia have set up little ambush spots in the woods, and they are shooting from the trees, they're shooting from the bushes. They're just massacring many of the British troops as they march back to Boston. And all along the way, they're killing them until they get to Charlestown. And once they get to Charlestown, the Patriot militias start kind of blockading the few entry roads to Boston and Charlestown, which starts the siege of Boston, the first major thing of the American Revolution. In all, 300 British got killed that day at Lexington and Concord, and 100 Minutemen were killed. The American Revolution had officially begun at this point, and now it's going to be up to the colonists to decide, well, are we just going to fight for a continuation of the current thing? Are we going to fight here to try to just get rid of the taxes, or are we going to try to fight for something even better? Which in some colonists' eyes, they wanted something much bigger than just the repeal of taxes. They wanted a new nation. They wanted the colonies to be independent from Britain. And that view is going to start coming into play here soon. Before we end this, I want to show these two images. Right here we have a painting of Lexington Green on the morning of April 19th of 1775 at Lexington. This was the very first, when the shot was heard around the world, this is when they first opened fire. You can see the Minutemen here returning fire after the British had presumably already fired at them back here. If I'm not wrong, the guy on the horse is probably John Pitcairn, who was the only major commanding officer there that would have had a horse. And another one for Concord, I don't have an image, but this is a plate that sits in my house and my room. It's a decoration. And it just simply is a small little kind of painted image of the Battle of the North Bridge of Concord. After the British marched, after they got through Lexington, they marched to Concord, and when they came to the North Bridge, they were confronted on the other end by Minutemen Militia, who confronted them from crossing the bridge. And they did not get across either. Concord, I think, if I remember right, was under the command of a man named James Barrett, I think was his name. But anyway, And if you go to Lexington Concord today, there is Lexington Green is still there. You can still see that. There is a memorial there to the Minutemen. And in Concord, the Old North Bridge where the British actually assaulted, it was destroyed over the years, but they have rebuilt it over the exact same site. So you can walk a rebuilt version right on the same stretch of where the original one was. So it's right there, the same site. It's just not the original bridge. So you can go see that. So that is all for this second little bit of the American Revolution video. If you have any comments, any questions, be sure to put them in the comment section below. As I understand, I may skip things that I maybe should talk about a little bit more. I may not explain it indefinitely, so be sure to let me know any questions or comments you may have in that section below this video. Our third video for this series, I will talk about the first half of the Revolution from 1775 up till 1777. And that we will I'll briefly mention the Declaration of Independence on there, but we're actually going to give that its own separate video as part of this series just due to how monumentous and important it is. So that will not be really heavily mentioned and explained. We'll do that on the fourth video for this series. So our next video is going to be on that. I will hopefully have that up on Sunday or on Monday. One of the two it will be up. Hopefully we'll get this wrapped up by the 4th of July. Now, once the series is done, I'll be more than happy to start with any topic videos that anyone may suggest. So, again, be sure to get me any ideas if you have any. At the same time, be sure to give a thumbs up on the video if you liked it. Be sure to check out the other videos on the channel. If you do like the videos that have been coming out and you're not subscribed, please do subscribe. It would not hurt you, because I'm sure that if you keep coming back, there'll be more that come in the future. So just be sure that you want to do that if you choose to. So that is basically all it on this video. Hopefully everyone has a good rest of their weekend, and we will see you all back here for the third video of the American Revolution, where things are truly going to begin in earnest as the Continental Army gets created and good old Georgie takes command, and the colonies start debating whether or not we're going to fight for the continuation of the current status quo as being colonies, or we're going to take a bigger step and try to fight for freedom and independence from Britain as a new nation.